You've stuck with me an awful long time here. We have covered so much ground in this series. We've started with the beginnings of NSX, or the architecture of, that was kind of where we started at the beginnings. We talked about logical switching and logical routing and talked about gateways and edge nodes and transport nodes and bridging and security services through firewalls and intrusion detection and prevention and intelligence and all kinds of stuff. We're almost there. NSX Federation is kind of the culmination of everything else we've been talking about. And this is really, really important if you need a multi-site infrastructure. That's where Federation comes into play, right? So this series of videos is the last in this greater set that we've been looking at for this NSX install, configure, manage. We're almost there, but we've got to get through Federation. There's a whole lot of cool stuff here that we want to think about. So Federation allows us to expand the boundaries of NSX to cover multiple data centers, multiple locations, multiple sites. And in order to do that, we have to think about things just a little bit differently. So here's the series we're looking at. We're about to talk about the architecture of Federation. What are the pieces that we might be thinking about? What are the pieces we might have to worry about? Then we'll talk about installing and onboarding locations into NSX Federation. And then the last couple of videos, we'll talk about networking and security respectively, because there are definitely things we need to think about in each of those contexts as we're trying to think forward to our multi-site locations or our multi-site configurations. So let's start with the architecture. Now, as we talk about the architecture, as we get ready to talk about the architecture, we really want to talk about why Federation. Why do we have this? What's it for? I know I've said multiple locations, multiple locations, multiple locations. But what does that matter? Well, it matters because ultimately NSX doesn't have any context of site or location in its entire platform. Well, it turns out that people want to have multiple data centers and want to be able to stretch networks across multiple data centers. And it needs to be, we need to have that capability. We implemented that by tacking on or building on the global manager construct. And global manager is now what manages the location idea. And it can manage up to 8 locations. Well, what are those locations? Those 8 different individual locations cover 8 copies of everything we've talked about in this video series so far, right? 8 NSX manager clusters, 8 sets of transport nodes, 8 sets of edge nodes, right? Each data center, each location that we have is a standalone NSX domain. And then we're using Global Manager and Federation to stitch those things together so that they can all behave and act and be managed as one large federated NSX domain. So the Global Manager is how we make all this happen. The Global Manager is a global policy engine, right? There's no, manager, if you will, right? If we think back to the architecture of NSX, we said, oh, well, in the management plane, we had the policy and the manager role. Well, in Federation, the Global Manager, that only has the policy role. There's no manager role here. It's just policy. And the policy role in Global Manager will send policy requests to each of the relevant local managers to have those things realized inside each given location. So the local manager, the NSX manager cluster that we've been working with, that's still amazingly important here. It's something we absolutely have to continue to have. So we're going to onboard local managers into our global manager. The local managers, though, are still responsible for everything we've looked at. They're still responsible for preparing the transport nodes, for deploying the edge nodes inside a given data center, for working with the vCenter server, the compute manager in a given location. All of these things, top of rack and core routing in each data center, right? As we're peering with those things, that all of that configuration is handled really by local manager. So local manager is still incredibly important, right? Each location is a standalone location. We can't forget that. And so, global manager just becomes a manager of NSX managers is really all we're looking at this point, right? There's no control plane in global manager. There's no manager role in global manager. Global manager is simply a centralized global policy plane for all of my different locations. Which means I'm probably going to use that policy UI at Global Manager to do a whole bunch of configuration. I may use the APIs. I've got a fully formed, API stack available with Global Manager as well. But I may still use Local Manager for some things. Now, we have to think about this, though, and what we want to use and where we want to use it. If I create something in Global Manager and that gets pushed down to Local Manager, well, then Local Manager can see it. If I create something in Local Manager, well, my Global Manager doesn't know about that. Right? It's a one-way street from global to local, not from local to global. So I have to think about that. Now, does that mean that all of my configuration has to be done in Global Manager? Well, that's entirely up to you and your operational strategy. I would suggest yes, it should, right? We should configure everything through Global Manager because that gives me a single source of truth, if you will, a single place to go and manage my entire infrastructure, no matter how many locations I have. But that may or may not be desirable given my use case for federation. Global objects are visible in my local managers. I just said that. They're read-only to the local manager, but they're consumable and visible to the local manager. Anything I configure in my local manager, well, that's not going to be visible to my global manager. I have to watch that, right? I have to watch that. Local manager is not pushing configuration up to global manager, right? Global manager is pushing configuration down to local manager. But does all of my stuff have to be stretched across multiple locations? Well, maybe not. Maybe not. So maybe I'm going to do a mix and match of management. Again, I probably want to do as much of my management through Global Manager as I can. That gives me a single, like I said, a single source of truth, a single point of management for everything. And having had to deal with multiple data centers in the past, I kind of like having one spot to go look every time. Even though I may want to manage everything through a central location, there are some things that I simply cannot manage centrally. How about preparation of transport nodes, my vCenter relationship that we talked about, right? Things like that. Those are all things that are going to be controlled and managed by, the local manager. So not everything gets to be centralized through Global Manager, right? Some things still have to be dealt with at the local manager level. So be prepared for that. Now, when I'm configuring objects, right, Global Manager is going to push a configuration only to the necessary local managers. So here we've got an example of I'm making some kind of a change, right? Global Manager is going to push that configuration change to the standby Global Manager cluster so that, if my active Global Manager cluster fails, I still have that configuration somewhere. And then it's going to push, it looks like I made a change to all three locations or something that spanned all three locations. So we'll send that request from Global Manager to each of the local managers because those are what are relevant, right? But I can, if I want, I can come in here and configure each location individually. We've said that a couple of times now. Here we're showing you a little bit differently that we can indeed manage NSX locally in any of my given locations. Now, if we think about this from an example perspective and say I want to create a tier 0 gateway and a tier 1 gateway and a segment, and I just want them stretched over location B, we can do that. And when we do that, here we see that we're synchronizing our configuration to the standby Global Manager cluster, but our configuration is only being pushed to location A and location B because those are the only relevant local managers for this particular equation. In other words, location C doesn't need to see this these structures, that segment and the tier 0 and tier 1 gateways, we're not stretching those objects to location C. We don't have to waste the resources programming the configuration over there. Right? But once the programming is done, once the realization of objects is done, we're still not complete, because my local managers now have to share a control plane, right? They have to synchronize control plane data so that MAC address 1 in location 1 or location A is also visible in location B for MAC address 2 for the virtual machine that's on the segment, the stretched segment. In location 2, it has to be able to find the virtual machine in location A, right? So we've got to synchronize our control plane data so that we can have the right IP addresses and know about them in each location. So that's Federation. That is about the quickest overview of Federation that we'll ever see. And realistically, Federation is not that complex, right? It's a management layer set atop multiple NSX domains. It's really, really cool stuff. What we're going to get into in the next few videos is a little bit more detail on how we're going to actually make it work. Come back. We'll see you there.